Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week is the optimistic ban on tobacco products, including vaping products, that the UK government has passed. And we say optimistic given that New Zealand's attempt to do exactly the same thing has effectively failed. We have the harmful effects of taking specific kinds of sports supplements that are intended to be antagonistic towards androgen receptors. There is a link between cats and schizophrenia. Why and how it is that tardigrades can survive being irradiated, and better yet, why it is that scientists have a particular penchant for making water bears suffer. There is an insect apocalypse caused by industrial and mass farming and agriculture, or at least so claims the media, and unfortunately for the media, the science says otherwise. France has decided that vegan and vegetarian attempts to sell their products as equivalents to a real meat option aren't going to be allowed to happen anymore, which really just makes sense. The role of gamers in microbiology research and how nearly 4.5 million gamers have contributed to medical science by doing so. A fundamental misunderstanding of how it is that solar or photovoltaic arrays work in generating electricity. And trust in science has taken a rather large hit, at least in Australia. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found below. Starting with the particularly over-optimistic attempt by the UK to ban tobacco products, in a manner of speaking anyway. Specifically, what they're doing is a rolling ban, and the way it works is simply, if you're born after January 1st, 2009, you won't be allowed to buy tobacco. Now, the irony with this is that there's probably already a large number of kids who are already consuming tobacco and therefore addicted, and now they're suddenly not going to be able to get their hit of sorts. Initial views of this are that it will turn into law, although that's based solely on the votes. The vote went a 383 to 67 turn, and so it has passed the lower house, with the upper house, or the House of Lords, generally going to approve it based on their historical penchant for not interfering with the lower house. It's likely to simply pass through. The only challenge with this is that, New Zealand did exactly the same thing, and not much later they've withdrawn that particular law. And so it's probable that the UK will end up doing exactly the same thing. Next we shift to what will be kindly described as somewhat questionable research. Research related to the human body and how it works. To an extent, we continue to try and better understand how the human body does many of the things that it does do. In a lot of cases, it's understanding what it doesn't do when things go wrong. But in other cases, there is research into what it does as a normal day-to-day thing. In this case, that the spine, to some extent, can not only learn and recall information, but be able to use that information without having to involve the brain. To be clear, the spine already does this to some extent. It is basically a reflex response. For example, if you touch something hot and it causes an unexpected sensation of heat, you will pull your hand away suddenly, but it doesn't necessarily require the brain to tell the body to do so. In the same sort of vein, you have things like when you have the knee-jerk reflex response. All of these things are based on the spine acting before the brain has any real say in the matter. This is where research using genetically modified mice in Belgium has found that certain genes, and one in particular that they were looking at, have a response in developing not only that memory, but the response to what could be perceived as a potential threat. Essentially, the spine developing an aversion to pain or otherwise antagonistic events. There is an argument to be made that given how dumb some people are, they might be relying on exactly this to get through life, They don't need their brain, and so they just use their spinal cord to get away from any of the dangerous phenomena and thereby survive. Well, possibly anyway. The same sort of phenomenon could be arguably said to apply to those using selective androgen receptor supplements. These are also sometimes sold as SARMs, SARMs. These are very much touted on social media to teens as a way to help you with developing muscle without having to use anabolic steroids. As you can imagine, anytime a supplement claims to have similar effects to an actual drug, you need to question what they're selling, and you should be very skeptical. In this case, it goes one step further. Rather than being a supplement, SARMs are actually classified as an unapproved drug. That's because they do actually have an effect on the body. It's a known dose response, and therefore they should be approved before they are being used. But, obviously with the name unapproved drug, they are not, and therefore the rather terribly regulated supplements industry has been able to get away with selling them when they really should not be. The issue with this unapproved medication is surprisingly simple and also terrible. What they do is perform a similar role to steroids, except rather than being a direct activator of the steroids, they instead stimulate androgen receptors. Androgen receptors are essentially receptors that are responsible to the sex hormones, for example, testosterone. And once you start fiddling with these, you're going to find that you have significant problems. Not the least of which is possible issues around fertility. As you can read on Science-Based Medicine, the reliability of these is incredibly questionable, with a variety of issues, not the least of which are that they can contain the actual product, but a lot of the time they don't, that they may contain completely different drugs, that you'll be very lucky to get the actual expected amount, and that sometimes they don't have anything in them at all, which actually isn't that surprising. In other, let's call it medication-related news, we have a major gene regulator of memory in CAR T cells. Now, CAR T cells are what are being sold as the major development in immunotherapies, mostly down to the fact that they can be used to create T cells that will activate and target things you want to attack. For example, cancer. However, it's actually getting these cells to do what you want that is incredibly hard, or at least much more difficult than it would otherwise be for most other similar sorts of medication. And this is where the FOXC01 gene could be incredibly useful, and we say could purely because it's a single gene and most of this is not related to just one gene. It's like trying to swap out a fuse in a car where everything is blown. You might get the lights working again, but nothing else will. In this case, what they found is that by modifying, or more accurately, promoting the activity of the FOXC01 gene, they can promote memory, and so they can more effectively and for a much longer time act the way they're intended to. Now, understand very importantly that immunotherapies like this are still very early in development. They have been used in a limited number of cases and for a limited number of conditions, but this could be, and we say could because remembering that this is preliminary research, be useful in making them work better and for longer. Of course, it could also lead to autoimmune diseases. It's really hard to say until we see actual clinical usage of this. Shifting to what is clinical but also equally weird, the association between having cats and schizophrenia. Although it's actually not that unrelated when you consider that cats are out to get everybody and you can't trust them. Cats don't have owners, cats have servants. But shifting from a less humorous take, the research isn't as clear-cut as you might think. The issue is several-fold, but the first is it's a meta-analysis of 17 studies, which isn't that many. It's a nice number, but it's not great. The issues that come after that are over what time frame. They looked at studies published over 44 years, which that's a bigger issue because there's a lot of change and development over 44 years. And it's over 11 countries, which 17 studies, 11 countries, you don't have a lot of overlap, and so you can't be certain in findings of one country will apply anywhere else. The interesting thing is that the research that stimulated the association between cats and schizophrenia is a theory that it could be a Toxoplasmosis gondii, or a parasite found within cat feces, that causes schizophrenia. But that particular theory hasn't exactly been proven. It's had a lot of mixed outcomes. Some have found more support for it, and others have found no support whatsoever. This is where the meta-analyses in those 17 studies have fundamentally been summarized as a significant positive association between broadly defined cat ownership and an increased risk of schizophrenia-related disorders. Or in much easier terms, owning a cat and schizophrenia are related. The actual value of this is, well, not as much, and that's because the rate of schizophrenia in the general population and the fact that owning a cat doubles that risk is still relatively small. More details can be found in the article linked below, but in short, you can't really rely on what they've found just yet, mostly owing to the poor quality of the studies that underlay or were the foundation to this meta-analysis. Moving to researchers that have a penchant for sadism, they were waterboarding bumblebees to see how long they could survive. Well, not quite. What they were doing was finding out how long bumblebees can withstand being underwater, and, well, unlike a human in Guantanamo Bay, bees can survive days, not minutes. In this case, the discovery is, let's say, fortuitous when research into things like pesticide residues, bumblebees hiding underground, and, well, rain was inadvertently demonstrated when queen bees were in tubes that got flooded, unintentionally, but still got flooded. And rather than, lose said bees, they decided to try and rescue them, but the problem was that some of those bees, in the time they were rescued, lived in that aqueous environment, to be generous. Nearly 81% of those bees, and specifically talking about queen bees here, survived the exposure, which is a significant number. Moving on to tardigrades, the scientist's punching bag, we have the decision to irradiate them and see how it is that they survive. Now, the research itself is not without merit, to be clear about this. It's just that tardigrades tend to get a lot of crap in research. They're not as bad off as fruit flies, but still, they tend to be quite often picked on. What is important here is that it's known that tardigrades, when exposed to surprising amounts of radiation, are able to prevent their DNA from mutating and therefore survive without any real issues. And so understanding what happens, the researchers are able to, let's say, apply that knowledge, not necessarily immediately and not necessarily in the most useful of ways, but they can apply it. And that this can, much further down the track, be useful if, and to be clear about this, it's a massive if, we were to start, say, traveling in space, where humanity would be exposed to significantly more radiation than we are on Earth. The researchers found that tardigrades have more than one mechanism that protects them from ridiculous amounts of radiation. Understand that they can be exposed to the equivalent for them of what would be 1,000 times the radiation required to kill a human, and yet they survive as though nothing was happening. One of the reasons they can do this is a damage-suppressing protein called DSUP, and it's well known. But there are tardigrades that survive exposure to radiation but don't have either this particular protein or anything like it, a homologue for all intents and purposes. Well, to be clear about it, not all tardigrades have this, but some do. And what is weird here is that although the particular species of tardigrade that was being experimented upon does have the DSUP, it wasn't activated. Instead, the tardigrade's genes were triggered to produce a wide variety of DNA repair mechanisms, and that these genes, when activated, had a huge increase in activity, leading to all of the damage caused by the radiation exposure to be fixed within 24 hours. Going from what is arguably scientists picking on a small microscopic animal to nature pushing back to some extent. Well, not really. It's a predictable phenomena, but it's also kind of cool. It's the North American cicada, well, one of them anyway, and they live on a cycle. It's a 13-year cycle, and it's known as brood 19. What is important this year is that, unlike others, this year overlaps with another brood of cicadas called brood 13. These will co-emerge at more or less the same time, affecting 17 states in America. Basically, nobody's going to get any sleep for the next few years. People are going to be kept up all night and all day from the sound of the cicadas making noise, wanting to have sex until they go back into a state of semi-dormancy for the next 13 or 17 years. The overlap with these two particular broods only occurs once every 221 years, and as you can imagine, given that date, the last time this occurred was the start of the 19th century, or roughly 1800. The activities of the cicadas underground are kind of like when children go quiet. You know they're up to something, we just don't have any idea what, and it's a fairly confident assumption that they're going to be causing trouble. Again, we just don't know what. And so it's curious, not just the fact that they live in an underground environment for 13 and 17 years respectively, but that at some point the two overlap, and whether or not there might be some interaction. Shifting back to, insects, but this time, the various media reports that are all kinds of wrong. Mostly the media reports that there's an insect apocalypse occurring and that it's caused by, a farming, but a farming on a large scale, and the use of various chemicals. The obvious one that people are going to blame is things like pesticides. That is, chemicals intended to kill insects for the most part, although it can also apply to things like fungus. The issue with this, and particularly how the media reports it, is that, it's wrong. There is no massive ecosystem apocalypse coming up on us now as we're killing off all of the, primarily pollinating species. Instead, it's quite the opposite. Surprisingly, the majority of insect species are increasing in population. The challenge with this is that, unfortunately, environmentalist is a rather charitable term for them, have moved the goalposts each time. The first issue was that they were claiming that just honeybees in general, that is basically anything you'd have in an apiary, was dying off. Then they've shifted the claim to being, wild bees are actually dying off now, and then it's birds, and who knows what they'll pick on next. Maybe it'll be those same cicadas. But actual numbers show that that's not true. Well, no, not quite. Good studies show that's not true. You can still find a terribly conducted research that will support that position, but importantly, it's bad research. Either methods are flawed, the sampling is bad, the actual conclusions aren't substantiated by the results found, or they're relying on really bad statistics, but there are all kinds of issues, and you can find that for any kind of research in the world. It doesn't necessarily apply solely to environmental research. The Genetic Literacy Project has a really good article, and it's one of a two-part series going through just why it is that much of this research is, let's be kind about it, overselling what it is that they're claiming, particularly related to the lack of evidence. Better evidence is disturbing and somewhat terrifying evidence of a gigantic snake in India. Thankfully, this nearly, 11 to 15 meter long or 36 to 50 foot long snake was only alive 50 million years ago, or thereabouts. So you're unlikely to encounter it today. Nonetheless, giant snakes are never fun for anybody. Just ask those who have played any role in Anaconda. The research is based entirely on fossil remains, and although the snake itself is nearly 50% to 100% longer than the longest living species today, it nonetheless existed, or at least the fossil remains exist. They're from about 40 million years ago and were sometime in the early Eocene era. Beyond just being incredibly long, the snake was quite fat, at somewhere around 11 to 12 centimeters or about 4.5 inches in width. Shifting to more agricultural news rather than animal news, we have France's decision around food labeling, and specifically that plant-based protein sources, that is pretty much any food that you see labeled as ham-like, meat-like, or whatever else like, and sometimes I don't even include the like, but has no actual meat in it, is no longer allowed to use those terms. Instead, the vegan industry will now have to recognize that their attempt to pretend that it's real food isn't going to work, or at least, again, in France. This is only the second national-level ban on vegan food trying to sell itself as real food. The other country that's done this is South Africa, and several states in America, but those states have state-level, not national-level restrictions. The reason for this is twofold, one of which is debate around the French language and its appropriate usage, which is never, unless surrendering, but it's also around the actual, expectation of a consumer. And no doubt, if you buy something and you're under the impression that it is a real meat product and then you find out it's vegan, not only will you be disappointed and your day will be ruined, but you would also want actual food, unlike vegan food, which is, plant matter. But less facetiously, it's transparency and consumer expectations. This ruling really just highlights the bizarre decision by plant-based foods to root themselves in not plant-based food, but specifically meat, and then try and sell themselves as just that, or at least an alternative to just that. Going from the food we eat to how food is made, and the use of drones to figure out which particular traits in a field are not only desirable, but then to allow for the extraction of the genes responsible for this to improve the production of food going forwards. It is taking modern technology and applying it on a larger scale, quite literally giant agricultural fields, to allow us to get more out of these same plants. This is a further development of the already nearly exponential growth of the agricultural growth and productivity that we've seen over the last 50 or so years. Sure, over the last 200 years there's been improvement, a gradual improvement, and then substantially more as things like the Haber-Bosch process allowed for the production of nitrogen fertilizers, and then the further developments around the ability to get more food out of the same field through hybridization, and then eventually genetic modification. But now we actually have a way to highlight which particular fields are most useful and how. Understand, this approach has strengths and weaknesses. On one hand, its strength is that it's relatively easy to do. Understand, easy in that you require a drone. The actual technology underlying it, and particularly the software, far less so. The downsides are that, it's a top-down image. It allows you to get some idea about what's happening, but it's not perfect. However, this is just one tool in a very big toolbox, and so it allows for the application of this knowledge, and therefore other knowledge, to more accurately and reliably select. For example, trying to understand whether or not there is a greater growth of leaves versus the actual desired, say, heads or seeds of a wheat plant, whether or not the plants are growing much too tall. For example, what is shortest plants, which is particularly useful for things like wheat and barley, so it doesn't get blown over by the wind. Whether or not you're going to get more harvest from that area. And so if you know that the area is small, but you get a large amount from that area, those plants are producing more. And the ideas go on. But nonetheless, it is a further example of using data, admittedly data that's perhaps not necessarily useful by itself, to help farmers make better decisions, or at least the seed industry make better decisions that farmers can then use. In other helpful news, we have the role of gamers in microbiological research. This might be odd, but it's not the first time that it's happened. For example, Foldit is a protein folding game of a sort. It's more like a puzzle, where the intention is to try and make a protein fit its known structure by, well, unsurprisingly, folding, shaking, poking, and prodding until everything works. This time, the community-based research is similar to that, but what's unique is that the research itself isn't a standalone game. Instead, it was a mini-game included inside of the commercially successful video game called Borderlands 3. What they did was to try and, refine and estimate relationships and microbes in the human gut using this minigame, and as said, it's been rather successful. By distributing this particular, let's say, challenge to so many individuals, the researchers are able to achieve what you simply can't do with a computer nowadays. Well, you can play the game with a computer, but you can't solve the problem, and that's simply down to the fact that existing knowledge and the various algorithms and software that we have available to achieve it aren't up to the task. It's simply not practical. But with a whole lot of humans, essentially monkeys typing away on typewriters, you can produce Hamlet. Or, more accurately, you can produce a completely new way of approaching this issue and solve some serious issues. It's this idea of technology that on one hand is incredibly cool. On the other, it's not something that we should tout as amazing just yet, and perhaps this is best shown by the next news item. It's what's described as an invisibility cloak, but it's not actually an invisibility cloak. It's a cloak, well, any article of clothing really, that lets you confuse and hide from any kind of real-world identification system, essentially face-identifying cameras and whatnot. And amazingly, it is really just that simple. It's a shirt with a pattern printed on it that confuses what the cameras are seeing. Those monkeys on typewriters producing the collected work of Shakespeare may also just as easily be able to make this particular, let's say, a development. The way it works in very simple terms is that most of this software and technology relies on having an existing database or knowledge of what it is that it's looking at, and therefore it matches what it's seeing against what it knows exists. By finding something, or at least creating something, that doesn't match into any of these existing data sets, it can, for lack of a better word, fail to match and therefore identify the individual. The irony of this research is that it was conducted in collaboration with Facebook, a company well known for its extensive use of, image identification and the variety of posts that are put onto its platform in an effort to mine it for data. In completely different kinds of news, but showing how even if AI or similar technology can be confused, humanity is certainly much dumber. It's an old post, but a post that's worth pointing out, and it comes from The Independent. It's admittedly just the headline, but the headline's more than enough, about a town in the US that has rejected solar panels due to concerns that it would suck all the power out of the sun. Don't worry, USA, we all know that your education system has failed long ago. You don't need to continue to prove it. All you're doing is digging this hole much deeper. The painful irony of it is that even if what they said is true, that being that it would suck energy out of the sun, the solar panels would actually have the opposite effect of what they're claiming. That is, if what they say, that the solar panels would suck the energy out of sunlight, that it would actually reduce the rate of cancer. That is because there would be no infrared light or UV light to cause damage to DNA and thereby cause mutations and consequently cancer. The other effect, of course, would be that given the price of electricity at the moment, it's, expected that if you could generate your own through the use of photovoltaic panels or solar panels, that, you wouldn't need to worry about energy as much, which would help house prices. Going from what is modern crazy to kind of ancient crazy, but claims that at least a part of the Voynich manuscript has finally been decoded. If you aren't aware, the Voynich manuscript is this bizarre book, and the book contains a variety of odd images, essentially high school boys and girls doodling in the back of their books when they get bored, except, medieval. In this case, it's been thought, and to be clear about it, a thought in that we have no knowledge of what it actually is, that this bizarre manuscript with otherwise unknown writing does contain some sort of, say, medical knowledge or something else. But again, no idea what, and all attempts to translate it was very unsuccessful. While we won't go into great detail on this, let's say, translation of the otherwise indecipherable Voynich manuscript, the content makes to at least some extent some sense. Although, again, they are basically translating a mysterious document, and it's incredibly hard, if not impossible, to establish what really is and is not. Shifting to more definitive research news, it's about integrity. It's something you can't really apply to the Voynich manuscript, given that it's entirely, let's say, inferred results. The integrity issue here is in Australia, and it's around the lack of a governing or a watching body to ensure that money going into research is used correctly. This is honestly a concern to some extent. Not necessarily because Australia has much money to speak of, but purely that what money is there could well be wasted and put into efforts that are completely pointless, or arguably in some cases lead to issues around, public health problems if clinical trials of something that shouldn't be run occur. As the article goes through, there are all kinds of issues around the way certain academics or researchers conduct their research. For example, p-hacking. That is when you take data that has been generated and you just run every possible combination of tests against it to see what will stick. And when that happens, you have your significant results, even if those same significant results weren't actually what you originally intended to look into, and in some cases may not even be significant when you look at them in the wider context of where they are. And of course, there is always the reliable plagiarism issues. That is, researchers who just don't bother to, either reference where they get ideas from, inappropriately reference, or, in some cases, completely misappropriate someone else's ideas. This is where Australia is at least somewhat more unique compared to a range of other countries. Unlike other countries where there is a government-facilitated, let's say, authority on this matter, Australia instead relies on universities to regulate their own academics, which doesn't really work, mostly down to the fact that the academics are getting the money that the university then takes a cut of because of various administrative fees and other bullshit that is used to, pull various nonsense, such as paying various administrators ridiculous amounts of money for their wages, for doing practically nothing. But despite this, the issue remains that the universities are expected to monitor and ensure the academics do what they're meant to do, and they don't have a reason to do that. The final news item we have for you is also related to misconduct, but it's an example of misconduct being identified and continuing to be identified. It is Retraction Watch's a weekly roundup of various events that are worth pointing out. For example, a journal editor that's being investigated for duplicating publications, which is a rather big issue. Generally speaking, you submit your manuscript and it gets published, and the publisher now has ownership of the copyright. You aren't allowed to submit it elsewhere again. Of course, in the case of some of the paper mill type approaches, this isn't an issue, especially when, as Retraction Watch has found, a list of nearly 100 papers that are possibly, if not arguably, written by ChatGPT. Yeah. The range of news items they have for you is honestly not only extensive, but rather worrying. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.